For the past couple of years, when Thanksgiving rolled around, I felt some homiletic urgency to correct some of the romantic myths about the warm relationships between early pilgrims in America and Native Americans. As absurd as images like this one really are, there were some instances of sharing and mutual aid between white European undocumented invaders and our indigenous Indian population. But those instances, no matter what they were, and they were not that many, they were all still a prelude to a genocide in which we wiped out a population of over 50 million people. I appreciate the fact that you've kind of let me get that out of my system over the last couple of years. But you know, when I was sitting thinking about this year's holiday season coming, I realized that the myth that has really affected us, the one that's haunted us, was not necessarily the fanciful stories about what happened 300 years ago, but more the fantasy that informed our childhood experiences. Wasn't really about pilgrims and Indians. It was more to do with our romanticized expectations. Our myths have had a distinctly Norman Rockwell influence. Christmas has its own dangerous pitfalls with unrealistic hopes for joy from receiving the perfect gifts in a perfectly decorated environment. But Thanksgiving is more about expecting this multi-generational family gathered around a traditional feast in which we read Langston Hughes' most embarrassing poem. We love Langston Hughes, but that poem is kind of like this painting. It's an idealized image in which Grandma and Grandpa not only are still living, but they never got a divorce. There's no drunk uncle at the table. There's no black sheep of the family who's always messing up everything for everyone. This is a holiday that is wrapped up in hope for a loving family. And I am sincerely happy for the handful of people that have actually ever experienced that. I really am. I'm grateful that that happened to them. I can say that my own rather puritanical home, even though there certainly wasn't any wine, let alone a drunk, there was no laughter either, but we managed to pull off some fairly large family celebrations, the smells and tastes of which I still remember very clearly and very fondly. At this point in my life, obviously my grandparents are dead. My aunts and uncles are all long gone. My parents are deceased. Even my sister has succumbed to cancer. And my older brother, with whom I celebrated many Thanksgiving dinners, voted for Donald Trump 2 years ago, and that has accelerated the dissembling of my family connections. Family, for all intents and purposes, for me, is now down to just me and my daughter Valerie, though we are fortunate to have many close friends who fill up the Thanksgiving and Christmas dinner tables for us in quite enviable fashion. The holiday season that holds out the promise of Norman Rockwell moments most often fails to deliver for most of us, and sometimes it's quite the opposite. There's a myth that has circulated among helping professionals that depression and domestic violence increase during the holidays. Statistically, it isn't true. Anecdotally, however, I could give you 40 years of stories that might make you think it's true. Seasonal affective disorder is a real thing. Days get shorter, the weather gets colder and more gray. People spend more time indoors. They miss out on the good serotonin their bodies produce on long walks in the sunshine. And family gatherings are often filled with the kind of material that will keep therapists booked up through May. Still, if you look at this factually, the suicide rate actually goes up in spring and summer. Domestic violence stats actually dip down a little bit on Thanksgiving Day and Christmas. Not enough to brag about it, but You know, when I was in grad school, we were taught to anticipate increases when in fact there are decreases. The holidays are not quite here yet, though both David, our associate pastor, and David and I try to spend a couple of hours together every Thursday kind of processing what ministry is doing to us. And we've both been exhausted by demands to respond to domestic violence and have both opened our respective homes to unexpected guests who have stayed with us longer than we wanted. That's statistically insignificant that at least in our existential experience, that we have had to deal with domestic violence in a close and personal way because we were trying to avoid suicide or child custody threats that came up when families come apart at the seams. Domestic violence is usually rooted in jealousy and control. Because the people we see in shelters are generally poor, we tend to associate these problems with poverty. The difference is, however, that we encounter people in Safe to Sleep or Harmony House or other domestic abuse shelters. We encounter the people who do not have the wherewithal to simply rent a hotel room or to rent an apartment of their own. The people we meet in shelters do not have a network of middle-class friends or family members who have a guest room that will take them in. However, it is absolutely true that domestic violence cuts across all economic, educational, racial, and national lines. Several years ago, David and Holly were living in Cambodia, where they were trying to work with some of the poorest and least educated people in the world about how to resolve their domestic problems without violence. At the same time, I was serving a big denominational church here in town where my most frequent domestic violence call came from a mansion where both the husband and the wife were physicians. Their live-in au pair would call me when the violence escalated to the point where the children were in danger. I honestly cannot remember how many times I pretended to just be in the neighborhood at 11 o'clock at night or after midnight and knocked on the door to just visit. Because if they had found out that the babysitter was ratting them out, she would have been fired. But I would show up and sit in the living room and pleasantly talk until the kids could go to sleep and the fighting stopped. Now, mind you, I'm not a physician. I don't even play one on TV, so I may be getting a little bit out of my lane here, but I am convinced that there is such a connection between the mind and the body that the cancer and the heart attacks that have afflicted this family, I believe, are at least partially a consequence of the mental illness in the family system that has provoked and sustained violence through all these years. Leo Tolstoy's book, Anna Karenina, begins by saying, all happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. In every family, there's a potential for success, and there is a potential for ending up in misery, or divorce court, or a spouse abuse shelter, or let's be honest, folks, a morgue. There are about 2,000 domestic partner murders in America every year. 1 in 5 women report having suffered physical abuse at some time in their life. Again, my own experience doesn't amount to statistical research, but during my time as a pastor in Kentucky, I had 2 domestic murders in my parish family. One was a husband who murdered his wife, and the second, a wife shot and killed her husband. Drugs were involved in the latter, money in the former. But as Anna Karenina says, unhappy families find a host of ways of turning their lives into hellish existence. Jealousy, control, infidelity, rape, molestation, addiction to drugs or alcohol or gambling or even shopping or hoarding, greed, dishonesty. These all feed resentments, which becomes the glacier that can freeze the most generous of hearts between people who've stood at an altar and sworn before God and family that they would love each other until parted by death, and they come to loathe everything about one another. What is less obvious is the kind of bonding that happens in chronically violent homes. Crisis bonding seduces victims into a nearly unbreakable bond with their abuser. It's painful to those of us who love and care for a victim when we see them returning over and over and over again to their abuser. The national average is that a woman will leave her abuser 7 times before she successfully gets away and doesn't go back. Even in the shelters, when we have finally gotten a woman and her children safely behind secure doors, we find them constantly trying to sneak their abuser in for a visit. It is very difficult to break the bond that people form in a crisis. But in the midst of taking them back, victims will lose friends. They will lose the confidence of their family. They've told everyone about the abuse, the horrors they've been through, and a week later they're back with the abuser. And then their friends and their family don't want to be around them. They don't want to talk to them anymore because it just seems like they're inviting more abuse. The national average is 7, but I have known victims who have skewed those numbers by going back dozens and dozens of times. Their abusers will tell them, "No one will ever love you as much as I do." One of the people that I have sheltered, her ex tried to kill her, and a week later called and told her that he loved her. It's amazing how seductive that kind of thinking can be. The abuser will tell their victim, "You can't survive without me," and then they'll try to make sure they can't. Many will threaten to kill their victim if they try to leave them, making it seem like it's actually safer to stay and endure the violence than to try to make a return to sanity. This is almost impossible to understand unless you've lived through it, unless you've loved someone who has returned to the abuser over and over. But the last thing that victim needs is for us to give up on them. The last thing they need is for you to cut off contact and to lose your desire to see them spend more time with their more stable and, frankly, more sane friends. Now, none of us here live static lives. All of us are always in transition, as if we were forever on a moving train. We are going somewhere, either towards failure or towards success. But for a family to be successful, that is to have a meaningful, mutually supportive, and generally happy relationship, there are several factors that must be present in every case. In fact, there's a Harvard biologist that has created what's called the Anna Karenina effect. That is, for an animal to survive, it has to have a set of certain factors that without that, they will become extinct. Now, many of these factors, when it comes to human relationships, are fairly obvious in terms of sexual fidelity and all the kinds of intimate aspects of family life. But the one that I think needs to be stated out loud, particularly in a church from a pulpit the week before Thanksgiving, is forgiveness. Not amnesia. And I want to make this distinction very clear. Every abuser that I have ever known of, every addict, wants and demands amnesia from their family members. They want to pretend that what they did last week, last month, didn't happen. And you're a bad person if you bring it up. But forgiveness is not a denial of facts. Serious forgiveness acknowledges reality and chooses not to turn past wrongs into present resentment. Forgiveness requires love and compassion, but you should never think that forgiveness requires stupidity. You never have to pretend that you don't know or you don't remember what has happened, which has clear consequences. Love and compassion are not martyrdom. There is no merit, there is no heroism, there is no virtue in staying in a toxic relationship. When people try to draw you into a reality-denying, violence-accepting, self-destructive relationship, the most loving thing you can do is to refuse to be a part of it. When someone says, look, I've got 2 tickets to Crazy Town, do you want one? The answer is no. You have to make that powerful decision. No, not going to Crazy Town. We're all on a moving train. We are just going to different places. And sometimes getting to the place you want to go means you're going to roll through some sketchy neighborhoods. But don't get off at the station that's titled, "This place will mess up your life." Don't stay there. I've been known to just flatly tell some people, both by my former regional ministers, denominational judicatories, as well as people I've dated, I have an honest, mutually respectful relationship to offer to you. I do not have a dishonest, competitive, jealous, or toxic relationship to offer to you. So you have to decide, do you want what I have to offer, or are we through here? And you would think that that's a really attractive offer. You imagine someone saying that to you, I have a healthy, sane, mutually beneficial relationship to offer to you. But I will tell you, in almost every case, it is not accepted. It's sad that many people with whom you might choose to be a professional peer, a business partner, a friend, or even a family member are only willing to enter that relationship if you are willing to at least episodically be their victim. But folks, that is their problem. What I'm begging of you is for you to choose to go in the direction of health and happiness and never to consciously and try not to unconsciously choose to be anyone's victim. And yes, I know it's not a simple thing. The motivations of love and family are as crooked as a corkscrew, and you will find yourself living in a victim role without ever even remembering the convoluted steps that you go to get there. But as Winston Churchill said, if you're going through hell, keep going. In preaching, I often try to engage you in conversation by talking about polar extremes. On this eve of our annual holiday season, with all of its likely family gatherings and office parties, I apologize for contrasting the idyllic Norman Rockwell scenes with scenes of domestic violence. You have to recognize that those are the polar extremes. The nature of my work and David's, both professionally and in my community volunteering, brings me into much more contact with the frightening underbelly of domestic violence than most of you will ever dream of seeing. For every family that gets down to fists and guns, there are dozens that just quietly simmer in contempt and resentment, which is, in my opinion, just a piece of the same cloth. Few people ever achieve the perfect family status, and no one wants to end up seeking shelter from violence. All that I'm saying is that we're all on a moving train. But you shouldn't jump on just any train that's leaving the station. You have to think about where you want to end up. You have to think about what your goal for yourself and your family is. You have to carefully study the map, choose your destination, and go in that direction, and board the train that will take you where you want to go. There's a saying in AA that I love. It says, "Don't tell me how sick you've been, tell me how well you want to be." Don't dwell on the past. When you go to your family gathering this week, take the sweet potato casserole, but leave your resentment at home. If you get to choose between a family debate about President Trump or a backyard game of touch football, go play football. Regardless of the choices made by your Fox News-infused uncle or your alcoholic cousin, I'm encouraging you to choose sanity. Don't dwell on how sick your family has been. Focus on how healthy that you want your family to be. It may not entirely depend on you, But honestly, you have no idea how much power there is in your choices.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.